Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from here in Taiwan. I'm Jaime Ocon. Taiwan's largest annual military drills, the Han Kuang Exercises, have ended. This year, the focus was supposed to be on unscripted combat scenarios, but a typhoon forced the military to transition to disaster relief. Joining us now to understand the Han Kuang Exercises this year is Mike Hunzeker, Associate Professor at the George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government, and a former U.S. Marine having served in Iraq. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's first zoom in on the Han Kuang Exercises themselves. Why are these drills specifically important for Taiwan's defense?
Well, I think there are two main reasons I would say these exercises are so important. The first is obviously it is an opportunity at the largest and highest levels of command for the military to rehearse and to practice these very complicated maneuvers. Second, it's an important signaling tool, sending a signal to the Taiwanese people that the military is prepared to defend them, sending a signal to Beijing that indeed they should not attempt an invasion. And of course, we can't ignore the fact it needs to send a signal to Washington that improvements are being made to the military and that Taiwan's military is worth investing in.
Han Kuang has been going on for about 40 years, since like the 1980s. And this year was supposed to be the first time that these drills were unscripted, focusing on decentralization. Can you explain what that change is, why it's significant, and even the motivation for that decision making?
As best I understand, the decision was made because there has been a lot of pressure from analysts in the United States, but also in Taiwan, that the military is too hierarchical, it's too centralized, which means that the decisions are all made at the top and that the people at the bottom, the captains, the lieutenants, the privates, they wait around for orders. And so you need to allow frontline officers and leaders to make their own decisions. With that in mind, though, I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical, because a major exercise like Han Kuang is not necessarily the best place to try to introduce this bottom-up way of making decisions. The simple fact is this exercise is so large and it involves so much interaction with civil authorities and the cities and the municipalities that planning started months, probably even years ago. And so for the administration at the very last minute to say, we're going to go unscripted, simply isn't going to happen. That's just not the way these things actually work.
And one of the biggest headlines that came out about a month to go before Han Kuang started was the getting rid of the red team versus blue team drill. Can you quickly describe what that red team versus blue team scenario is, like in the sense of just a basic drill?
The whole idea of red team, usually, at least in the US way of saying things, red team means the enemy, the adversary, blue team means your own team. But the scripted piece was they were told exactly where to be and when to be there and how they would attack. Here, everybody knew that the red team was going to make all sorts of decisions that would advantage the blue team.
Do you think that was a good decision, just scrapping the entire red versus blue? And do you think that that's going to affect the military going forward?
On the one hand, actually getting rid of the red team, blue team makes sense because this has been such a long-standing tradition and it is so very scripted that it just shakes things up and it shows people, the soldiers, but also the voters, that we really are attempting something different. And also my understanding is that the red team used to be the Marines and Special Forces, and they need to practice their actual role in combat too, so that's good. On the other hand, the best way to do unscripted would be to use units like Special Forces and Marine Forces and have them think the way that the enemy would. Because if you really want to surprise your people, give them the freedom to say, here's the battle space, attack the way you see fit.
Now, back to Han Kuang. The first 2 days focused on force preservation, so like pulling back aircraft, moving away from the front lines. And the second was defending off of a landing, of a potential invasion. I want to start with the first part. How realistic is that part of the training?
So any exercise that gets Taiwanese leaders to think about how do I conserve and protect my forces, it's better than nothing. Here's the problem, is the more you run these exercises, because in the exercise it always works, the more you delude yourself into thinking, hey, by simply flying my jets to the other side of the island, I will protect the small number of jets that we have, which is something like 300. Just for context, I think the Chinese have something like 3,000. And then if you add in 2,000 plus missiles and long-range rockets, China's ability to take out Taiwanese jets and Taiwanese ships, I think it's got about 30 surface fighters in the Navy, is so overwhelming that it really kind of doesn't matter where you move the things. China's probably still going to be able to get at them, and we can't ignore the insider threat. And so when you put these together, realistically the only way to keep these weapon systems alive in the earliest stages of a war is to get them off Taiwan entirely. But if you do that, you have two problems. First, you demoralize the people who watch their F-16s flying away from Taiwan, And second, as a very practical matter, one of the big things that concerns American analysts is this so-called anti-access threat. That China has long-range weapons that can hit our ships and our jets when we're trying to come from far away. Well, if China can do that to us, China can do that to Taiwan.
In the later days of Han Kuang, it kind of transitions into actually fighting, pushing a potential invasion off, anti-airport drills, anti-air drills. How realistic is that portion of the drill?
There's a glass half empty way of looking at it and a glass half full. I would say the glass half full is this exercise is really for the first time trying to emphasize ground defenses. That really is a vulnerability for the Taiwanese. So I was happy to see a lot more emphasis on ground defenses, nighttime operations, those are all good things. Flip side is, although you need to do live fire, there are certain places you can do it and certain places you can't. But most of the images I saw coming out of the exercise, and these are the images the Ministry of National Defense wanted us to see, I mean, you would basically hold those up to an American soldier and say, this is how you don't do it. So for example, there was a squad of about 8 soldiers protecting a bridge, and there were inches between each of them, and they were all in a perfect line, and that is just an absolutely perfect target for somebody that wants to take out a squad that's guarding a bridge. If you see things, you can kill them. So the last thing you want to do is have them close together so that one missile or one rocket can take them all out. And worst of all is to put them in a line, because you put them in a line, you get one drone or one jet coming along that line, and you can take them all out very quickly.
It seems very easy to make these comments, right? Why do you think it is then so difficult for the MND to maybe take those comments and maybe apply them to the ground level, those troops there?
We should be careful. It is easy to describe this way of fighting. It's actually really hard to do it in practice, because it's much easier to get everybody in a line and have them shoot, because that's a safe way you can control it. And of course, you want safety. You don't want exercises hurting lots of people. But the problem is, in combat, troops are going to resort to what they know in training, and that's why you really should do what you can to stay away from it. It's really not just about the weapons. It's about a fundamental change in mindset and culture. The Ministry of National Defense, I think, is a bit more resistant than your average organization. For this ministry to be told by outsiders, this is what you should do, might actually cause resistance. It's also an organization that has no real warfighting experience, and so it doesn't have lived experience, and it has this culture of centralized decision-making, which, to go full circle, is why I'm a bit skeptical that simply because the Minister of National Defense says unscripted, it's not like flipping a switch. You really have to imbue a fundamentally new way of thinking.
You know, this year's Han Kuang, unfortunately for the second time in a row, was cut short because of a typhoon. Do you think Taiwan should maybe get used to the fact that because it's in an area that sees so many typhoons and earthquakes, that maybe conducting a drill during these conditions?
Certainly there is a risk-benefit calculus that the highest levels of military and political leadership have to make. And I can understand the need to say this typhoon is large enough and threatening enough, we need to pause. Pause, I think, should be the operative word. Because if you really want to show that you have an organization that can adapt on the fly to an unforeseen circumstance like an enemy attack, like showing China and Washington the ability to say, you know what, this thing, we spent a year planning for it, a typhoon came, but we will adapt, we will pause, and we will start again, or we'll recock and do it again in September or in October. I think that would send a very powerful message that the Taiwanese military gets what we mean by flexibility and adaptability and pushing leadership down to lower levels.
Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about Taiwan's overall defense capabilities. And I think this is actually a good time to bring in your experiences having come to Taiwan to train parts of Taiwan's military.
I was a U.S. Marine officer from 2000 to 2006. And after a few months in Okinawa and then 2 tours in Iraq, I was assigned to a training command to train new officers in the U.S. Marine Corps on how to use the amphibious assault vehicle, which Taiwan has. And so my unit was assigned to help train Taiwanese officers in the United States and Taiwanese Marines here in Taiwan. And I have to say, I was really left with the impression that Taiwanese officers and soldiers are every bit as capable in terms of their intelligence and their willingness to fight and sacrifice as any U.S. Marine or any U.S. soldier. But I also noticed that they weren't being used in the best way possible.
How has Taiwan's defense capabilities changed over the past 20 years?
This gets back to this piece I made about culture. Like when the Taiwanese officers would come to the U.S. and I would compare them to officers from other countries or U.S. officers, they were reluctant to make decisions and to make mistakes. But making mistakes is the only way you learn how to make decisions. If all you ever do is make a decision that was told to you and that always turns out right, then you're going to feel very frightened to seize the initiative and make a call if you're really forced to do it. And so I guess fast forwarding, about the only things I saw were conscription being shortened, people feeling even more frustrated that when they were in uniform, their time was being wasted, and at least for some number of years, in particular under the Ma administration, a real decision to stop spending money on the military. And so now we're in this new period of cross-strait tensions. There is a renewed sense at the political level to say we got to take this seriously. The other thing that concerns me is that the Taiwanese people just don't seem to, and some of this I think comes back to political leadership here in Taiwan, but to really think the threat is real and that this could actually happen. It kind of still seems, I think, science fiction-y. There are more pressing concerns. How do I get a good job? How do I pay for an apartment here in Taipei? I get that, but the threat is real. I don't think people in Washington are inflating it. I think there's a sense that this could actually happen, and we're very worried about it. And we notice a disconnect between how we think and the Taiwanese people think.
I guess in that time, I take it a couple years back when you and Admiral Li Ximing were trying to push for that ODC, this overall defense concept. You keep talking about this asymmetric kind of strategy. Why do you think that is the way to go for Taiwan's defense?
In general terms, when Admiral Li was talking about the overall defense concept, when Americans say asymmetry, what we mean is Taiwan, no matter how much it spends on its military, is just so small compared to the threat, and the threat that we think is very serious. Taiwan spends about $20 billion a year. China, we think unclassified, spending about $700 billion. And so the only way to survive an onslaught of that size in a world in which it's going to take the United States a long time to show up, we think probably 2 months or more, the Taiwanese have to be able to hold on and hold out. They got to hold the door open. So the idea of asymmetry is if you're the weaker actor, buy large numbers of cheap things like drones and naval mines that are inexpensive and you can lose a lot of them and there'll still be enough of them to impose unacceptably high costs. Hopefully that convinces Xi, don't even try. But if it fails, what it will do is going to make it hard enough for the Chinese that for weeks and weeks and weeks they're bashing their heads against the wall, and that's going to buy the US military time to show up in force.
You brought up the United States and holding the door for that. In a couple months, we're going to see this election. Going forward, what do you think both sides, a Democrat government and a Republican government, can offer to Taiwan in terms of ensuring Taiwan's defense?
I think it's reasonable to suspect that if Kamala wins, that the administration's policies will probably look a lot like what the Biden administration's policies looked like. And President Biden has made very clear, and I very much believe him, he'll fight for Taiwan. On the other side, we of course have Donald Trump. There, I think there's a bit more range for uncertainty. I think all of the interpretations point to the fact that he is frustrated with Taiwanese unwillingness to really embrace some of these changes and to spend more on the military. Another way of looking at it is, we have heard from his first administration, he may not care about Taiwan, but he may say this is just an unwinnable fight. What he would actually decide to do if he were in office and if he were forced to make that decision is anyone's guess.
What side do you think Taiwan needs in that sense of defense cooperation, and if it wants to continue the status quo of peace and making sure they can deter conflict, which side do you think is better for Taiwan's defense?
So I think actually both sides are good for Taiwan's defense insofar as both sides have, if we were to overlap the two sets of arguments I just made, both sides have made very clear Taiwan's not doing enough. So I think regardless of who wins in November, the course forward for Taiwan's military is pretty clear. Higher levels of spending, and we need to pair that with a real push at the political level and the highest levels of military leadership to just fundamentally transform Taiwan's military from the bottom up, to empower junior leaders to make decisions. It's not just about weapons. You can fight asymmetrically with all sorts of weapons, but all things equal, spending less money on small numbers of very expensive things the Chinese could probably take out pretty quick, and more money on small, mobile, lethal, redundant things.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us and sharing your insights on today's program.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more of our stories, be sure to tune in to TaiwanPlus News and follow us on our social media. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.